So the events of the story still make me think back to that night, and I'm still trying to process what exactly happened. The events that took place on the strange night were about 10 years ago from the moment I'm writing the story. My friends and I were 17 years old and spent most of our weekends with each other, a habit that started back in elementary school, playing video games and sleeping in each other's houses, all through middle school and high school. This was our weekend routine. At one point during senior year, we decided that we wanted to mix things up a little bit by taking the little night drive. It was myself, who had a license and a car at this point, and my two friends, Robbie and Scott. My parents trusted us because, all things considered, we were good kids. The night started out like most nights. Scott and Robbie showed up at the house to sleep over for the night. We ordered some pizza, played some games, and just talked about school for a little bit. Shortly after 11 p.m., we decided to go for a ride. For no other reason than to listen to some music and just exchange some good old-fashioned conversation. We just drove for a while, turning down roads that we didn't even know existed, and before we knew it, we'd been driving for several hours, and I couldn't remember the last time we saw streetlights. It was extremely dark and desolate wherever we ended up driving. Around 1, maybe a little bit later, we were driving down this really eerie and very poorly lit road when we approached a car that was on the side of the road. But it was not just parked on the side of the road. It was kind of somewhat crooked, and the hood was tucked into the shrubs, almost as if though the car had lost control and got into an accident. The red taillights were still giving off a soft glow on the road, and Robbie suggested that we look in case someone fell asleep at the wheel or something bad really happened. If someone had got into an accident, it would have taken hours for paramedics to find them if we didn't do something right now. We slowly and cautiously approached the vehicle. It was an older red Honda Civic. We got out of our car slowly and began approaching this red car. Robbie said in this really braided voice, "Hey, anybody there? You hurt?" And there was no response. And as we got closer, I shouted, "Wait." While we were walking over, I started to make out some type of figures in the back seat just sitting up. And Robbie shouted again, and this time with a bit of urgency in his voice, "Hey, are you okay?" Again, there was no response. No noise at all except for the motor of my car running several feet behind us. After a moment, Robbie finally said whatever and approached the red car, and we followed closely behind him. Even though I felt something was wrong in my gut, we all were shaken with immediate fear as we went up to the window. There was, in fact, a person in the back seat, but almost more hauntingly, it was a mannequin, not a real person. And my first thought was, who in God's name would drive around with essentially a lifelike doll in the back seat? Admittedly, we got a good laugh out of this for a moment, but then the paranoia of this situation came back. Robbie continued to scream if anybody needed help or assistance, but there was still no response. And this is when I noticed that this mannequin had something in its plastic hands. It looked like some sort of tape, a VHS tape. Without thinking, I took the tape, and I didn't even tell my friends until later that night. We decided to just call the police, which we should have done in the first place, and we reported this abandoned car. The police asked for the license plate number, and that's when we noticed that there was no license plate on the car. Whoever ditched this car either didn't have plates or took those plates with them, and all they left behind was that creepy mannequin with that old VHS tape. So we made our statement and told the cops the location of the car and left. Later that night, while we were talking about this incident and just how crazy it was, and that's when I told my friends about that tape that I took from the car. In a sort of shock, and perhaps a bit upset that I didn't mention it before, they of course wanted to watch it right away. On the sticker in front of the tape was this plain white sticker that only just said, "Watch me," written in black marker with very crudely drawn skull and bones. I had some pause, but decided that we had to watch it. Curiosity was getting the best out of all of us at this point, and I found my parents' old VHR in the crawlspace and hooked it up to the TV. The tape began with about 5 seconds of a black screen and just the sound of a static tone. Then a man came on the screen with a beard and long hair. The quality of the tape was horrible. He stared into the camera, almost as if though he were staring right at us, and he wore a red flannel and sat at a table next to what appeared to be a workbench of some kind. He stared into the lens for 2 minutes straight without saying a single word. We watched the time, and it was the most unsettling 2 minutes of my entire life. And after those 2 minutes, he laughed, and then sort of morphed that laugh into a cry, all while staring directly into the lens, and finally said in this sort of low, monotone voice, "This tape belongs to me, and I know you have it. I'll find it again, and you'll be sorry." He then followed this with another horrible laugh and cry combo. We then fast-forwarded the tape for several minutes, and nothing else was said other than a few laughs, and just this strange man staring at the camera. And finally, it just cut to black, and it ended. Now, after a bit of conversation about this situation, being stupid kids, we decided not to give the tape to the police. I just kept it, and after all these years, the tape still sits in my bookcase. I'll never watch it again, and I never even really spoke about this event until now writing it down. And I'm sure this is just some kind of stupid joke, but to us kids, this was burned into our brains for years, and I'm still kind of scarred by the mental images that I witnessed that night. Every time I see a man that resembles that man from the tape, even after all these years, I still get that pit of the stomach type feeling, and I'm reminded of that fear and paranoia that I felt in that evening. Why did he have a mannequin in his back seat? Why did he crash his car? And why did he have a tape there?
This happened when I was home alone as a kid. It was the summertime and I was home during summer break. Both my parents were at work, and I think I was about 12 years old. I have an older brother and he went to one of his friends' houses that day. When I was home alone, I would just hang out and do whatever. Usually I would go on the computer that we had and play Minecraft or something like that. It was probably sometime in the early afternoon, and I had been on the computer in the living room for a while. I moved into the kitchen to get something to eat. The kitchen was at the back side of the house, and we lived in a split level. I will also mention that the neighborhood was pretty average and a little bit on the quieter side. It was when I was standing in the kitchen that I saw something out the window. I just barely saw movement at first, but it looked like somebody was walking by. I moved over to another window to see. That's when I saw a man walking to the back side of the house. He was wearing a sort of construction vest and had a hat on. I realized that it must be the leader reader. I remember that they came around every so often to our house. I calmed down almost immediately. I had been a little worried seeing the guy walking into our backyard. He went to the very back side of our house and near one of the basement windows. I went back to finding some food in the kitchen. After I was in the kitchen for a good 5 minutes though, I looked over and noticed that the guy was still there. Usually, they would come and go really quick and only be there for like a minute at most. I went back into the living room to go back on the computer, but a short time later, I just had the feeling that I should get up and make sure that the man was now gone. Maybe it was because I was home alone and a kid, so I was a little bit paranoid. I carefully walked back over to the window and could see that the man was actually still there. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't tell exactly what he was doing because I could only see part of him from the angle that I was at, which was higher up than he was. He seemed to be doing something and was near the basement window, but I couldn't tell what exactly he was doing. I thought about going downstairs and looking out of that window, but I knew that the man would see me right away if I did. I went to walk over to another window upstairs, which would have a better angle, but I had to be careful so the guy wouldn't see me. Unfortunately, I really messed up. As I was walking over, I accidentally hit a can that was near the edge of a counter in the kitchen. I knocked it over and it fell onto the ground. This made a loud noise, and the next thing I knew, I saw the man quickly walking away. He moved back to the side of the house. I moved to the front of the house, and I watched the man casually walking down the street until I could no longer see him. I felt like he was really suspicious. I questioned whether he was even a leader reader or not. Why would he leave so suddenly like that? For the most part though, I was just happy that he was now gone. I went back to the computer. I stayed there for the most part until my brother and parents came back home. When they did, I didn't even think to tell them about the guy that had been there. I thought he was gone for good. My brother's bedroom as well as mine happened to be in the basement, and my parents' bedroom was upstairs. Because it was summertime, we would stay up pretty much as late as we wanted. I remember that on this night, my parents went to bed, and my brother went down to his bedroom. I stayed up and was on the computer. All of the lights in the house were off, except for a small lamp in the living room near me. I stayed up on the computer until I got really tired, which was probably at about 1 a.m. Then I turned off the lamp and went downstairs to go to bed. When I got downstairs, I had to walk past the little living room that was in the basement in order to get to my bedroom. As I was walking past, I happened to see something in the window. The man was back. I could only see a figure of a man, but I could guess who it was. This was the same window that he had been at earlier in the day. I then heard noises coming from the window as if it was going to come open. I was suddenly really afraid. It was really dark down there, and I hit the light switch, which I happened to be really close to. When this happened, it lit up the whole room, and I could no longer see the man very well. I heard some noise from right outside the window though, and then it sounded like he was running away. I went running as well, but back upstairs into my parents' bedroom. I knocked on their door and yelled for them to wake up. About a minute later, my dad came out, asking what was going on. By the time I explained it all, the man was long gone. My dad went out and inspected the house all around though. He was able to find that the back window the man kept messing with had quite a bit of damage. It had almost came off. It was like the man had been trying to remove the window and get inside the house, and he was really close to succeeding. After that night though, the man never came back. I remember being really scared for a while that he would, and I slept upstairs on the couch because I felt safer there. Luckily, he never did. What happened in this story took place around 4 years ago. To set the scene, me and my family live in what you would say is a nice neighborhood. It's outside of the city limits, and the houses are not right on top of each other, but you could walk to the neighbors within 3 minutes or so. Therefore, it's not really the type of neighborhood that many scary or weird things happen in. Although the only time I've ever really been freaked out over something that happened while living in this neighborhood happened in early summer while both of my parents were at work, while I and my brother were at home alone. I was around 16 at the time, so we were easily able to take care of ourselves. It was really starting to get warm outside and in our house as we live in the south, so I then opened our sunroom door. I left the screen door shut, but I had opened the main door to let in some air from outside. After doing so, I lay down on the sofa and I ended up dozing off. I was awoken by the sound of the screen door handle turning and what sounded like knocking. It jolted me out of my sleep, and to my surprise, there were 2 men standing in the doorway. One knocking on the wooden part of the screen door, and the other was turning the handle as if it was just going to come right in our house. I leaped off the couch and quickly went to the door, asking them what they needed. The order of the 2 men stated that their car was right down the street and that their battery had died, and they needed to be jumped off. Now at 16, I wasn't really thinking that they had any malicious intentions, so I told them to wait a second, and I would call my dad and asked if he had any jumper cables in the garage. I closed the main door that had previously been open, and I went and got my phone off the sofa. The 2 men stayed in the same position and watched me through the door as I called my dad. From the start of our conversation, my dad was already really weirded out once I told him what happened, and then he told me he had the jumper cables with him in his truck at work, and that I just needed to tell the guys to try somewhere else. After getting off the phone with my dad, I went back to the door and I told the men I didn't have any. I then apologized for being unable to help, and I shut the door back. I then just watched them as they walked just past the bushes that lined up our driveway. They got into an old silver sedan, and then drove out of our neighborhood very swiftly. I immediately started freaking out, as they had literally just told me that their battery died and they needed to be jumped off. I called my dad back, and I then explained to him that the men had just gotten into a car that was supposedly dead and how they sped off. He told me to just lock the doors and to call 911 if anyone else came back to the house. Thankfully, no one returned, and nothing like that ever happened again. I can't even begin to imagine what would have been in store for me if there had been any jumper cables in my house.